Hello, friends, and welcome to the Nugget Climbing Podcast. This is Stephen Dimmitt. A couple pieces of housekeeping before we get into today's episode. I put out a new follow-up episode with Alex Johnson last week, in case you missed the teaser for that. Alex returned to Bishop a couple of months ago, and she succeeded in completing her decade-long goal of climbing the Swarm. We talked about that one in our first conversation. She was very public about trying it the first time around in her early 20s, and she wasn't able to do it, and we had a conversation back in the fall about what it was like to fail publicly like that. And this time around, she snuck out to Bishop quietly, and only her girlfriend knew she was trying the Swarm, and she got that thing done. So, a huge congratulations to Alex, and it was awesome to connect with her again and hear all about it. So, if you want to check out that, there is a free teaser right there in your episode feed. And I want to take this opportunity to clarify the follow-ups and this whole Patreon thing, because I've been hearing that some of you are confused about that. So, every time I put out a teaser, you'll see those pop up in your episode feed for the regular podcast. I also put out the full version of that follow-up the same day. And the way to get access to the full version is by signing up for Patreon. And I also want to clarify that the teasers are usually just the first quarter or the first third of the conversation. And I always try to save some good questions or maybe a deep dive into a fun or interesting topic for the later part of the conversation. So if you can't get enough of the podcast and you've been enjoying some of those teasers, there is a lot more content that you will get access to by signing up for Patreon. Right now, there are 16 follow-ups published, and as soon as you sign up, you get access to all of them. And you will continue to have access to all of them as long as you are an active patron. And you can cancel at any time. So if you decide it's not for you, that's great. No hard feelings from me. And the final thing I want to clarify is the length of the follow-ups. I believe I said in the ad roll at the end of the teasers that the follow-ups are 20 to 30 minutes in length and occasionally longer, but I really need to update that. Most of them have been more like 45 minutes to an hour, and a couple of them have basically been full-length episodes, an hour and a half, and I think one I did with Natasha Barnes was 2 hours. So again, a lot of great content in those follow-ups. And if you ever listen to a teaser and are wondering how much more of the conversation you are missing out on by not being a patron, I also list the length of the full version in the episode description that shows up in your podcast app. So if you're listening to a teaser and you scroll down, you can see the exact length of the full version right there. And you can decide if giving me $5 is worth it to listen to the rest of the conversation. So go check out my follow-up with AJ because she's a badass and that conversation was awesome. And check out those other teasers in your episode feed and consider signing up for Patreon. Patreon really has become the backbone of this podcast. And at this point, I could not be doing it without you guys. I really appreciate all of the support, and I probably don't say thank you enough. So thank you, patrons, so much for your support. It really does mean a lot. And every patron really does make a difference. It makes my day every time I see a new sign up, and it means the world to have your support. All right, Eric Hörst is my guest today. Eric is the force of nature behind trainingforclimbing.com. He's authored several books on training for climbing, including a book by that very name. He also hosts the Training for Climbing podcast, which is a treasure trove of information on training, kind of a lecture style where Eric unpacks different topics related to training and performance in each episode. And Eric is a total lifer climber himself. He's been climbing for over 40 years, and he still climbs 513. In fact, he recently climbed his first 513C, so he's climbing harder than ever at age 57. And his sons are both total crushers as well, both climbing 514, and his son Cameron recently sent Bone Tomahawk, that route that Joe Kinder put up in the Fin Cave, which might be 515A. It sounds like it's either 15A or 14D/15A, depending on who you ask. So super awesome, and a big congratulations to Cameron. This is a two-part episode. I'll be putting out part 2 next week. In part one, we talked about Eric's career as a meteorologist and some of the similarities between predicting the weather and training for climbing. We talked about his early years in climbing and some of his early route development in Pennsylvania and in the new River Gorge. We talked about how training has evolved over the years and what's changed. We talked about the different effects that campusing and hangboarding have on our fingers. That was super interesting. And Eric shared a couple mistakes that he had been making in his core training for many years and how he has course corrected, and he shared his current approach to training your core to climb harder. Lots of great stuff in this episode, and I really enjoyed talking with Eric, and I hope it's helpful. Please enjoy part one with Eric Hörst.
Cause no one can do it like we do it, like we do it, like we do it. Cause no one can do it like we do it, like we do it, like we do it.
Okay, well, let's let her rip, and I'm happy to talk about anything, because I've been climbing for I'm on year 45 now, so there's a lot of territory to cover. Obviously, my involvement in training for climbing is probably longer than anybody on the planet when it comes to, I wrote my first articles in the 1980s on the topic, so so I can speak on a lot of topics, giving my opinion and thoughts on things. So, let her rip.
Yeah, perfect. I'm really excited for this conversation because of exactly what you just alluded to. And my idea for this conversation is really to kind of follow these two arcs. And the first one is, given that you have had a foot in this training for climbing world longer than just about anybody, I think you did write the first training books or some of them. And you continue to update your books. That's something I really appreciate about your writing is you revisit the research, you own the things that have evolved and changed, and you update your literature. But one of the biggest topics that I'd love to dive into is how you've seen training evolve. And then I think another really fun topic would be, now that you have two grown boys and they're both total crushers, they're climbing really hard, 14 plus, 515, it'd be really interesting to explore how their training has changed or how their training differs rather from your own or, someone like me who's 31 years old but started climbing much later in life. So those are kind of the things I want to dive into today, along with some of your own climbing background. I think that'd be a really fun place to start because that's something I actually don't know much about.
Yeah, sure. How old are you, Stephen?
I'm 31.
31, okay.
Yeah, but before all of that, I would love to kick things off actually by asking you about the weather.
Yeah.
This is a rumor I had heard, and I was like, I have to find out about this. Someone told me that you were a weatherman in a past life, so to speak, before really diving into training for climbing.
Right. I actually did TV weather, like the weather guy standing in front of the green screen. That was a long time ago. It was 1988 to 1992. So we're talking 30 years ago. But my college degree from Penn State in the mid 1980s was in meteorology. When I was a teenager getting into climbing, my other passion was the weather. And, climbing is affected by the weather. So they really, in my mind, were quite related. And so that led me down two paths. I've kind of through my life had two careers and two passions, one being rock climbing and training for climbing, and the other being meteorology. And so while my TV career was brief, it wasn't a career that I thought was sustainable and didn't mesh well with my desire to travel a lot as a climber. I did stay involved in meteorology. I worked at a university, Millersville University in Pennsylvania, for 30 years. It was kind of a 9-month-a-year job. During the semester, fall and spring semester, I was the director of the Weather Center. And so it gave me a stable job through my climbing life, health insurance for my family. But I also had the summers off because as a university position, I didn't have any real obligations during the summer season. So that kind of, it was the mode I was in for many years. I was a climber and a training for climber, a coach. But I was also had this university job 9 months of the year, kind of a 9-to-5 job that gave me security for my family. Now I'm since retired from that job, and I'm still active as a climber in my 50s, and I have this new company, PhysiVantage, that we could talk about a little bit later on, that I started. That's the focus for me here the last few years. But yeah, I mean, I'm the type of guy that is passionate about life, and I've worn a few different hats over the years.
I had to look into it for myself, so I found an article last night from the Lancaster Online, maybe newspaper, I guess, and it was talking about your retirement. It sounds like it was just last year that you retired.
It was last year, yeah. I mean, again, having a family and needing health insurance for my kids, I hung on to that job a long time, and it was a good job. Working in the university environment is awesome. I was blessed to have that position, but you get older in life, and you have fewer days left to climb hard, and your time becomes more and more valuable. And so, in the last couple of years, starting this company, PhysiVantage, things had kind of run its course with the university job, I felt. And so I retired, and, I don't want to say I'm a full-time climber because I'm still working, more than 40 hours a week. But, the focus of what I do is now pretty much 100% climbing related.
That must feel really good. I want to read a short paragraph from this article. You were called a superhero, and there's a quote from a gal that works at the university that was interviewed, and she wrote, "I have his autograph in a little frame on my bookshelf because we all consider him a superhero," said April Hörst, superintendent of the Warwick School District. She sent many an anxious email to Hörst asking for his best advice about a predicted storm.
Yeah, I'm kind of a snowstorm fanatic.
Okay.
And I'm not so much for severe weather and tornadoes. That's not my cup of tea when it comes to the weather. I enjoy a good snowstorm. And so, that's kind of, I guess, my specialty was forecasting nor'easters here. I'm in Pennsylvania, and so those are some of the most impactful events here in the northeastern U.S. are these big nor'easters. And so in past winters, one of the things I did was would brief, media and, various organizations and businesses on, an upcoming storm. And, so I'm definitely a scientist, whether it's with regard to training for climbing or whether it's, my university position. I've been, I am a very analytical person and like solving complex puzzles, which is what the atmosphere is. And it's what rock climbing is and training for rock climbing is. And so the two, while quite different, kind of both leverage a skill set that I've developed and that, I was kind of naturally born into, as a youngster, the whole math and science thing. And so it's done me well, I guess, in both career paths. But, again, there hasn't been a year since college that I haven't written articles or books about training for climbing. So, I really, truly did have two career paths over a very long period of time. And, I had these two passions, and I was able to really compartmentalize those two jobs. You have to have a system to be able to function at a high level in two very different, roles, and to be, trying to be prolific in both roles in terms of, what I generate and the quality of what I put out. I have very, tight or high expectations, whether I'm putting out a training article or a podcast or writing a book or whether I'm, working with students at the university. I'm always striving to be kind of an A grade presentation, though I fall short, and have certainly, had my mistakes, whether it's a weather forecast or, even in training for climbing. There's a lot of things I've changed my mind on over the last 30 years. And, when it comes to what is useful for climbers in terms of training. And so I'm not shy about admitting I got something wrong and correcting the record, and that's why I do update my training books every 5 or 6 years. Training for Climbing is on its 4th edition, and it's got 7 or 8 foreign translations, and so it's a resource not only used by climbers here in North America but around the world, which that's really cool. I kind of joke that I'm recognized here in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, as the weather guy, but internationally, I'm recognized as the climber and the climbing coach. And so that's pretty cool.
That's very cool. Very cool. And I want to dive into that book and how you got into that in a second here. But I have to ask one more weather question because I find it so funny, us climbers, especially when we're projecting and getting close on a project, we all become amateur meteorologists.
Yeah.
We all have like 3 different weather apps on our phone, and we're cross-referencing and, when do you think's the best time of day to try for the red points and all this sort of stuff. And I don't know, the humidity's a little higher today. Should I rest? Should I wait? Do you have any practical tips or pieces of advice or anything that you've drawn on from this wealth of experience as a weatherman, meteorologist, and applied to red pointing and hard climbing?
Well, yeah, I mean, especially here in the Eastern U.S., where humidity is just a constant factor, or, it is most of the year. And, the humidity can change dramatically day to day here in the East, whereas in the West, things tend to be a bit more stable. And if it does rain or snow, it's gone usually in a day or two, whereas things linger much longer here in the East. But I guess kind of in terms of giving something actionable to listeners, the best send conditions are kind of like what is your best training program or your best diet. It has to be very personalized because everybody has different skin conditions. I have very dry skin. My one son has very moist skin, and so for us, the best send conditions are going to be a little different. I often, when I'm out west, like a little more humidity in the air because of my dry skin. Whereas in the East, often, people with sweaty hands are just, praying for a drier, lower humidity day. So, and temperature, same thing. I have Raynaud's syndrome, which is kind of a microcirculatory disorder, kind of a genetic thing in the fingers and toes. And so if the temperatures blow about 50 degrees or 48 degrees Fahrenheit, my fingers and toes turn numb. So I can't climb on cold, windy days. Whereas, my older son Cameron has his shirt off at 48 degrees, when he's working on a route. So, the best send conditions are very personalized, and so if you're climbing with a few other people, you might have to, might make for a challenging, kind of planning out the day. One person might need sunshine to climb their best, and another might need shade.
Interesting. Well, thanks for all that. I'm so happy. I don't know why, but I'm so happy that rumor turned out to be true, because that's just great. It's a fun glimpse into your past life.
Yeah, I was going to say somewhere there's some old VHS tapes floating around with me doing TV weather when I was, age, 21, right out of college. And, the funny thing was back in that era in the late 80s, early 90s is when I was a prolific route developer at the New River Gorge. The New River Gorge just kind of became, known and was an early sport climbing area in the Eastern United States. And I was one of a small group of players there bolting routes. And so, I would be by day, a TV weatherman, and then I would jump in my car and go to the New for a couple of days and be, drilling bolt holes and, doing first ascents. And then I'd drive 6 hours home and I'd be back on TV the next day. And it wasn't sustainable, obviously.
That's amazing. I mean, that's a great segue. I'd love to jump into your backstory and how you first got into climbing, and then we can transition into how training and writing about training for climbing came into play. But do you remember your first day of climbing?
I sure do. It was in March of 1977, and my older brother, my older brother Kyle, he's 7 years older than me, had learned to climb when he was in college, and I was still, I guess, just coming out of junior high and wanted to, try the sport. And my mom said, climbing was totally unknown then. I mean, for many people, they can't even relate to what climbing was like in the 70s. There were no climbing gyms. There were no sport climbs. It was done by a very small group of generally eccentric people, a lot of mathematicians and physicists back in the 60s and 70s, climbed like at the Schwangunks, one of my home areas. And so it was just an odd sport. Like I was the only person in my high school that climbed, whereas, today it's a very common thing among high school students. And so long story short, my mom said, when you turn 13, Eric, you can go climbing with your older brother. And so it was only a few weeks after my 13th birthday that we went out and did my first climb here in Pennsylvania. I think it was like a 5.3. And, but it was like many listeners can relate to, that first day is all it took. You were hooked from the get-go. And back then there weren't many kid climbers. There was, you could count on one hand, probably the teenage climbers in the United States, people like Christian Griffith or Hugh Hörst, and myself and a few others that got into it as teenagers. Now, most people or many people get into climbing through a climbing gym as a teenager. And so I was kind of an early adapter to the sport. And, it started this amazing lifelong journey for me where climbing has been a constant in my life since age 13. And I'm now 57. So like I said, I'm on my 45th year now as a climber. And, other than my parents, climbing has been the most constant thing in my life. And I can't imagine life without climbing.
I got quite a few listener questions for you, and I think I'm going to just filter them in because they cover a lot of different topics. But I have a question from Max. He wrote, I'd love to hear some history about his climbing in Pennsylvania. He's attributed to developing quite a few areas, and I'd love to hear what that was like and what the scene was like in those days.
Yeah, well, the scene was very small. There was probably in the state of Pennsylvania a dozen climbers back, say, in 1980. And again, they were mostly older guys, and there was a few of us youngsters. Hugh Hörst, Jeff Batzer, and myself were all high school students at the same time and climbed together. And, it was trad climbing, putting gear in. I was a lot of the routes here in Pennsylvania are poorly protected. We did a lot of top roping, and then we did some very dangerous things. When I started climbing, cams hadn't been invented yet. So it was just putting nuts in the rock and eccentrics.
Eccentrics.
Yeah. So it was a very committing sport, especially for a teenager. I often think about some of the dangerous things I did as a youngster, and I'm happy I survived it, like climbing at the Schwangunks all those years on R-rated routes. And we explored and found boulders and cliffs, road cuts, commonly were something we inspected because there's not a ton of natural rock in Pennsylvania. And so when we found cliffs, we developed them. Safe Harbor, which is now a very popular sport climbing area. A few of us and some of the older climbers developed the first few routes there in the 70s and top roped. And then with the advent of sport climbing in the mid to late 80s, Hugh Hörst and I bolted a few of the first routes along the Susquehanna River. And eventually it turned into hundreds of routes, which is now the Safe Harbor area, which is popular. It's a road cut, but it's a pretty good road cut for Pennsylvania. And then around Penn State, when I was a student there for 4 years, there were some quarries. So we bolted these limestone quarries, which unfortunately are kind of closed to climbing these days because of liability concerns. And then the New River Gorge, which I first heard about in 1986 and traveled there and did a 512A first ascent on my first weekend at the New River Gorge. And I saw miles of undeveloped stone. And so that caught my eye, as it did, other people like Doug Reed and Porter Gerard and Rick Thompson and Mike Arts and Eddie Bagoon. There's about a half a dozen of us, Kenny Parker, that, got very busy there for 5 or 10 years and helped the New River be born in terms of what it has to offer today, which is a lot of world-class climbing. So yeah, it was a very fun time, and I invested a lot of days, putting up first ascents, and it's really gratifying to see those areas still popular today.
That's incredible. I got a question from Adriel about your time in the new River Gorge too, and whether or not you and Rick Thompson and Eddie Bagoon, like how you heard about the new and whether you knew each other beforehand, and just kind of what the atmosphere was like between that cast of characters. Was there friendly competition? Was it just this sense of exploration and discovery? Can you paint a little bit more of a scene?
Yeah. So the New River Gorge was, a climbing area, a trad climbing area with some excellent cracks from the 70s into the mid 80s. And there had been a few hundred routes put up that were all traditional lines, gear protected lines. And my arrival at the New River Gorge happened to coincide with, the beginning of bolting. And so I bumped into Rick Thompson, who was one of the activists there putting up trad routes. On my first visit, I met him and we exchanged phone numbers. And he that winter bought a Bosch Bulldog drill and invited me to come down. And kind of the rest is history. He and I formed a partnership for several years and put up a lot of classic routes. We put up the first 513 at the New River Gorge, which there's now probably 100 513s, but I put up the first one in 1987, a route called Diamond Life. And so that opened up a new grade at the New River Gorge. In fact, when I arrived there, the hardest route I think was 12A or 12B. And within 2 seasons, we had the grades up to 13A, 13B. And at the same time I arrived, Doug Reed, a tall Southerner, arrived. And though we didn't climb together a lot, he kind of had his mission and his eye for putting up new routes, and myself, my own eye. And so we were kind of developing at the same time. And he basically lived there, whereas I made this weekend commute 6 hours each way. And so it was, I don't know that I would say it was a competition because there was half a dozen very active people also putting up routes. But it was kind of where we were all challenging ourselves to, kind of find the great lines and, do the FAs of them. And, back in that era, again, 13A was kind of the top grade, or 13B. Since then, of course, there's now, 14 plus at the New River Gorge. And Jonathan Segrest put up the first 15A at Summersville Lake last fall. And so it's, the climbing has, been amazing through that period. And we've seen the grades continually, travel from 13A in 1987 to 15A in 2020 with Segrest's first ascent.
Mm. Do you have a favorite first ascent from that period? Does any one particular route really stand out to you, or?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I've put up 200 routes at the New and, over 400 routes nationwide. So there's a lot to pick from, but I don't know, a 12A called Bull at the New Sky and a 12B called The Gift of Grace. They're both classic New River Gorge arête routes, very steep arêtes, sustained, technical, classic New River Gorge technical routes where a 514 climber could fall on a 12 because it's technical and maybe hard to decipher on first go. So those are two of my favorites. And I guess like Welcome to Conditioning and Just Send It, 2 routes I put up side by side at Fern Buttress, the left end of Endless Wall, are classic, 13A, B kind of routes. There's so many great routes at the New River Gorge. It's hard to pick a few.
So it's interesting. You called yourself an early adapter as far as climbing goes in general, just because so few of your cohorts, your peers in school were doing it as a junior high school kid or high school kid. And then clearly with training, you were one of the first people to at least be writing about it and really exploring it. I've had a number of conversations on the podcast about the bolting wars, about the transition from traditional climbing to embracing sport climbing, not just as far as bolting goes, but also the tactics, the hang dogging, the red pointing.
Right.
Do you remember how you thought of that when that transition started to take place? Was that something that you had any reservations about? Did it seem like the obvious step forward? Do you remember kind of what that... With regard to
the bolting, the bolt wars and stuff?
Yeah, just the transition into sport climbing. Do you remember how you felt about that at the time?
Yeah, I mean, I was, that was right in the prime time of my, route development career. And so, I started off as a trad climber, as all people did that got into climbing in the 70s or early 80s. And so that was, what the accepted practice, ground up climbing, putting in gear, and lowering to, believe it or not, at the gunks, the old style was, if you fell on a route, you would lower to the ground and pull your rope and start again, because it was a trad area. Everything was ground up. And then from Europe came the idea of wrap bolting and hang dogging, and it really quickly caught it on in a handful of areas like Smith Rock and Shelf Road, and in some of the Front Range crags of Colorado, and at the New River Gorge, and I guess New Hampshire as well, all kind of in the mid to late 1980s. And so for me personally, it was an odd transition, because I got the idea that, I understood the concept that with bolts, we could protect these blank faces. Like at the New River Gorge, there are a lot of blank faces that are climbable, small holds, but there's no gear to put in. And so to have the ability to put in just a couple of bolts, you opened up like a route like Diamond Life, the first 513 at the New River Gorge that I put up. It had, 3 or 4 pieces of gear, and then it had 2 bolts to protect a blank section. And that's how, 513 came about at the New River Gorge. And so for me, there was a couple of seasons of transition where we were putting up mixed routes. Not just me, Doug and Rick and other climbers were doing the same thing, because we were all trad climbers. And so to come in and just put a line of bolts up the cliff, putting bolts next to a potential, TCU placement or nut placement seemed offensive to us. And whereas in Europe, they were just putting bolts in, from bottom to top at the sport areas. And so it took time for us to kind of go through that transition. And so for the first couple of seasons, when we were bolting, we were putting up these mixed routes at the New River Gorge in 1987, 1988, 1989. And then by about 1990, things had evolved to the point that, I think it was Doug Reed first, bolted a route out at Endless Wall called Legacy, a classic 11 plus that had bolts next to a crack. And so it raised quite a stir. And the same thing was happening at other crags around the country at the same time. And that's kind of the bolt wars era in the late 80s. At the Schwangunks, they started to bolt routes, and that didn't last long because it was, again, offensive in an area with such a deep history of traditional climbing with, no bolts. Whereas at the New River Gorge, it caught on and gained acceptance. And that's how it was across the country. Some crags, held on to the old school ethic, and other crags, things became more progressive. And so even at the New River Gorge by 1990, all of us who were developing routes started to put bolts in, even where there was some gear to be had. And in the case of some classic early routes like Diamond Life, which was originally a mixed route, I went back a few years later and just put in bolts the whole way, because it quickly, things evolved to the point that people would show up at the crag with just quick draws. And so they didn't have gear with them. They weren't going to climb a mixed route, and so things, and it's still in my mind something that's kind of hard to reconcile, because, the old school trad in me, does kind of say, well, it's not hard to put a TCU into a slot. Why would you put a bolt there? But then again, there is a beauty and a simplicity to sport climbing. And when the climbing gets hard, putting in gear or putting in marginal gear when you might be falling a lot is an issue. And so I guess, made that progression myself by the early 1990s, as did most route developers back then. And today, I don't think most climbers would think it's all that controversial. In fact, they probably don't even think of it when they go to a crag and clip a bolt next to, a gear placement, because that's just where the sport is at now. At least sport climbing is at.
Yeah, they probably don't even notice. They'll only notice if there's no bolt there. They're like, what the hell?
Exactly.
I don't have any TCUs.
Yeah, and that's an interesting thing, Stephen, is that, part of that transition to putting in a few bolts to avoid putting bolts next to gear placements, we were very conservative with our use of the drill. And so even at the River Gorge, like today, people go there and they're like, why is that first bolt so high? Probably at Smith Rock as well. Why is that first bolt 15 or 20 feet up? And it's because it was bolted in 1988, and that's how things were done. You used the fewest bolts you could. And so the New River Gorge and Smith Rock, those old classics are kind of spicy. Whereas, you get on a route that's been bolted in the last 20 years, at a place like Ten Sleep, let's say, or, in Lander or, anywhere. And the first bolt's 7 feet off the ground. You can sometimes clip it while you're standing on the ground. And so it changed quite a bit from, 30 years ago.
Yeah. A lot of people listening will have heard this, but I had a conversation with Alan Watts, and I remember him saying something to that effect, like, hey, we weren't trying to be bold. We weren't trying to be brave. I was just hand drilling all of these holes with one drill bit. I think he said he hand drilled like hundreds of holes with a single drill bit and didn't know that you were supposed to sharpen them. So he's just trying to spend as little time doing that as he could because he wanted to climb. So.
Yeah, it was an interesting time, and the history of climbing is so interesting. How that all came about. I wish more newer climbers, people that got into the sport in the last decade, let's say, would. I encourage climbers to become students of climbing, and my own sons. We have bookshelves full of books, which I've encouraged them to explore. And when we travel, as a family to climb, when they were younger, I try to share with them the history of climbing because there is such a rich history. And even when it comes to training for climbing, you mentioned that I was, one of the very first to talk about training for climbing and write about it. But really, I say the godfather of training for climbing is a guy named John Gill, the legendary boulderer who was doing climbing specific training in the late 1950s. So, and of course, he was bouldering at a level that's kind of like V9 or V10 in the late 1950s. He was just in his own league. And so that is the individual that I credit as kind of getting training for climbing started. And he was a big inspiration to me and my generation. Todd Skinner and I often talked back in our day about how, the John Gill Master of Rock biography was kind of a Bible to us. It was a book written by Pat Ament back in the 1980s, and it documented just a little bit of Gill's training, with weighted pull-ups and one-arm pull-ups. And, that was kind of, there was no training literature out. It was so the Gill book was like the closest thing that we as, young climbers in the early 80s, that was kind of the closest thing there was to a training manual, was kind of just copying what this amazing guy, John Gill, was doing, so that kind of got me started. And then, I got involved with gymnastics in high school and, as a scientist, started delving into sports science in the mid 1980s. I wrote my first training article for Rock and Ice magazine in 1987 and for Climbing magazine in 1988. And those were the first articles written, I think, in the United States on training for climbing. So that was kind of the beginning of trying to popularize training for climbing. Was back at that time when I wrote those first few articles, which in hindsight were so basic and actually quite dreadful. But I had this idea that climbers could climb better if they trained. And back then, nobody trained. In fact, here's an interesting little anecdote, Stephen. When I first reached out to Rock and Ice magazine and Climbing magazine to write a training column, both of them, their first response was, climbers don't train. Why would we want to write something about training for climbing? Why would we want to, dedicate a page or two of every issue to training for climbing? Wow. And so that was the mindset of 1986, 1987, is that climbers didn't train. They just climbed. Now, fast forward to 2021, and training for climbing is ubiquitous. You go to Instagram or you go to a website or your email list, and there's just a flood of training material, and literally people drown in it. That's a whole nother topic. I hear from climbers pretty much every day who say they just don't know who to listen to or what to do because there is so much material out there. So that's almost a bigger problem than having a lack of material back in the 1980s. But I twisted the arms of the editors and got them to edit and publish my first few articles, and then that started me on this path for the last 35 years in studying and trying to share training knowledge, because I had, of course, benefited from the training I was doing back in the 80s. And really, there were a few climbers who trained. It was the best climbers, Lynn Hill, John Backer, Ron Kauk, Wolfgang Gulick, Todd Skinner, those handful of, leading edge climbers, Alan Watts, those folks did train, but what the editors of the magazine felt is they're readers of the magazine. The massive climbers didn't train. And they were right. There weren't climbing gyms and there was no literature. And so, there hadn't been this paradigm shift yet. But again, I was kind of, I was certain that there was a value in doing training, both in helping you perform better and perhaps even reduce injury risk. And so that, was kind of, lit the fire inside of me to start this journey of never-ending learning and being very curious about the things that climbers can do to support their passion.
Yeah. Well, that is all very fascinating. I'd love to dig into what some of your early training looked like, and we can start to kind of roll out the evolution and talk about the evolution of training and how you've seen it shift. But that's so interesting. So you started in the 70s, climbing on hexes and, nuts, trad climbing. I can't imagine that there were any indoor climbing facilities at all. You mentioned doing gymnastics in high school. I know that's something likely that was influenced by John Gill, because he was always leaning on gymnastics and using, rocks as kind of gymnastics implements and thinking about it in that way.
Yep.
What were some of your earliest training experiments? Do you remember?
Yeah, well, you're right. There were no climbing walls. The first climbing gym in the United States didn't open, I believe, until 1988. In the Northwest, in Portland or Seattle, I believe, or maybe which.
I think Seattle, yeah.
Yeah. And there were a few indoor climbing walls in the UK because it rained so much. I think they glued holds onto a brick wall and had, that was kind of some indoor climbing there. And what a few people from my generation did was we would go in, like what I did at my parents' house when I was a kid, is in the basement, I would screw wood blocks onto the rafters. And so you could train for in my case, the Schwangunks, which was my main climbing area in high school. The crux of most routes there at that time were going through overhangs, climbing through roofs. And so having blocks of wood on the rafters of your basement ceiling and climbing across them kind of developed the specific muscles and the posture you needed, and the core tension you needed to do those gunks roofs. And I, credit some of my early hard ascents at the Schwangunks to that very simple training, elementary training. And as I said, in high school, I ran cross country a couple of years, and I joined the gymnastics team, mainly just because I saw Gil, photos of Gil using the rings. I had yet to talk to him at that time, though we did form a bit of a friendship in later years. He's an amazing guy, but he inspired, Skinner and myself and Lynn Hill to do some of that training. Lynn ran into John Long, and John Long got her into various types of training that included some weight training. And so there were a few people, Jim Collins in Colorado, that did some training, but it was so basic, lots of pull-ups. It's kind of funny, Dwayne Raleigh, the former owner of Rock and Ice magazine, a climber of my generation, he once commented to me a few years ago how he thinks back to how we, as climbers in the 80s, we would do like hundreds of pull-ups a day just because there wasn't much else to do. And the irony is that we spent, most of the climbing back then, you were standing on your feet, it was slab climbing. So why were we doing hundreds of pull-ups when we're climbing slabs? But the answer is, it just seemed like, there wasn't much that we knew to do. And it seemed like an obvious thing that, doing pull-ups might be beneficial. And it was when it came to crack climbing. If you're climbing a long vertical, crack, your biceps can get pumped, and doing a lot of pull-ups can be helpful. But no doubt we were gluttons for punishment and did a lot of things that probably didn't help our climbing at all. But the blocks of wood on the basement ceiling did. Tony Yaniro invented the death board, which is kind of an overhanging board with wood screwed on. So he kind of took what we were doing on the ceiling and tipped it more like at 30 degrees overhanging, which made sense to him because he was beginning to project routes that overhung that way, like in the late 1980s. And so slowly climbers kind of kludged together different things that seemed climbing specific. The hangboard was invented in the late 1980s. I think Methodologies and Entrepreneur had the first couple of hangboards that came out. And so that was an obvious tool that you could hang in your apartment or house and do some specific finger training. Most climbers back then did a little bit of running because it was obvious that you needed to optimize your body composition, and strength to weight ratio matters. It's a key performance indicator in our sport, especially if you're on overhanging routes. So you need to work on the strength, the numerator, but you also want to be thinking about the denominator. You have to find kind of what is your optimal body weight, not too light, not too heavy, and try to get that strength to weight ratio at its highest. And so we were kind of thinking through the things, but a lot of the tools hadn't been invented yet. And the climbing gyms, when they finally started to multiply across the country through the 1990s and into the 2000s, that was a game changer because then you could actually climb several days a week. If you were a city dweller, as I was, and many climbers in the Northeast or on the West Coast were, we were city dwellers who were weekend warriors. Whether it was driving to Yosemite on the weekend or driving to the Gunks or the River Gorge on weekends, most of us had jobs or were in school. And so the climbing gyms, the ability to have a home wall or to join a climbing gym in the city, that was a game changer because, of course, climbing is first and foremost a skill sport. So if you want to get better at climbing, you need to climb. Pull-ups aren't going to get you there. And so that was, I guess, the biggest change that really ushered in higher standards of climbing. Today, 512A isn't really considered that hard of a grade. But, 25 years ago, I wrote a book called How to Climb 512 because back then, very few people climbed 512. It seemed like this, distant goal to get to that grade. I mean, I'm talking in the 80s or early 90s, 12A was considered really hard and 13A was elite. And, today those grades are quite common. You climb a few years and do some of the right things and you can climb at those grades. Pretty much a normal person or everyday person can. And that's amazing. And you have to credit the climbing gyms as being the number one reason why, because suddenly you could develop this skill set more rapidly and have a very specific way to train in your home, on a home wall or at a local climbing gym. And so, that was the real game changer.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And it's probably worth clarifying because, these days we still use the terminology, the weekend warrior. We use that phrase, but it really doesn't mean the same thing now that it meant back then. Back then, before climbing gyms, you were literally only climbing on the weekends and then maybe doing your hundreds of pull-ups per day midweek. But these days, weekend warriors climb in the climbing gym Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. Yeah. And they're actually 5-day-a-week climbers and only climbing on rock on the weekends. But that's a very, very different thing.
That's right. And so that's the game changer, is the ability for people to have climbing near their home, and so that's, was revolutionary. It's, a hangboard in your house is one thing and it's nice, or a pull-up bar in your house, but being able to, go to a climbing gym and, boulder for an hour, a couple of days a week, or being able to tie into a rope and do, 50-foot lead routes indoors. I mean, that is game changing for sure. And, today's climbers, they can't imagine a world without climbing gyms. It's pretty, it's quite interesting to think about because that is normal to them.
Right.
But to my generation, it was just revolutionary, to be able to take your training and your climbing indoors. And so, the definition of a weekend warrior is quite different now.
So it's interesting. There's a lot of ways to tackle this, but I guess I guess what I'm curious about, just in general, when I think about the evolution of climbing training, there's been this wave, especially in recent years, with so many more people getting involved with it and so much more literature and peer-reviewed research to look at from other sports and from climbing. There's a lot more science kind of coming into our training, and people are starting to add more structure and things like that. But it's really interesting to me, thinking about all those names that you mentioned, John Backer, Kauk, Alan Watts, Todd Skinner, some of these guys, Wolfgang, they were just doing really playful, intuitive things. They were just, simplifying, thinking about what it was in their own climbing projects that was limiting them, and then just making up things, at the campsite that they could do, like the Backer ladder or hanging up little hangboards and, Todd's mono pull-ups and all these things. It was just very intuitive and very playful, but it worked really well. And it's fascinating to me that so many of us, despite this influx of science and, structure and kind of more specific training, we're struggling to match the standards that those guys were climbing at 20 or 30 years ago. So I guess I'm really interested to hear from your perspective, you mentioned the hundreds of pull-ups per day maybe not being very helpful. It was just kind of the best you guys had at your disposal. But what are some of the things from those early iterations of training, maybe some of your early ideas in your books? What are some of the things that have stood the test of time, maybe that continue to align with like some of the deeper principles of training? What are some of the things that people were doing back then that are still really good training methodologies?
Yeah, well, you made some good points there, Stephen. And, you spoke to the idea that the early training that was intuitive, done by those elite climbers, was very often route specific. Jim Collins famously was, working on, I think, Rainbow Wall or Genesis, one of those routes in El Dorado, and found a building that he could adopt, and do some climbing on the building that simulated some of the moves and muscles used on that route. Or John Gill, in training for climbing in the Needles, he did the thimble, which at that time was the hardest free solo on earth in the early 1960s. The thimble, of course, is, the needles where there's conglomerate, the pebbles that have to be pinched. So John Gill, the university he was at and would train like rings and rope at in the gymnasium at the university, there was a concrete block wall with like bolts sticking out of it, I guess, that had basketball baskets attached to it at one point. So he saw those bolts sticking out of the wall and thought, hey, I can pinch those and climb on them and it will simulate the thimble, using your thumb and squeezing while you're pulling. And, Wolfgang Gulick, the campus board was invented because in the Franken era, he was working on these overhanging routes where you're pulling on one or two fingers and you couldn't get your feet on much of anything. So there'd be a lot of dead pointing and, lunging, or what we today call campusing. And he, along with a professor in Germany of exercise physiology, invented the campus board, to take plyometric training that had been used in, let's say, jumping sports for the legs and transfer that training technology that was proven to work to climbing by building what we now recognize as a campus board. That was back in the 1980s. And so that came about because it was a way of training specifically the fingery dynamic, arm movements of Franken-era climbing in Germany. And, Backer had a crack machine, that he built out of, 2x10s that simulated Yosemite cracks. And so, the early climbing or the early climbers to do training were clever, and they would kludge together these very specific ways of training. And despite some of the, shenanigans that they would do, like, walking a slack line while juggling, that doesn't develop any climbing skill. So there were a lot of shenanigans that were done and party tricks that were done that didn't transfer to climbing, but some of the core training that was being done did, in fact, transfer to them, opening up new grades and new levels of climbing. And now today we have a myriad of training tools and this flood of information. And yet I observe climbers or I hear from climbers or work with climbers that can't get results or they end up injured. And it is because there's so much for them to pick from. It's easy to pick the wrong things. It's easy to consume a lot of energy training, but in ways that aren't going to help you with your project. And so in some ways, it's even more challenging today than it was back then, because back then we had very limited tools and you include something that made sense given your route or project or area that you climbed at. But today you have a gym filled with tools or maybe a home gym filled with tools, and you feel compelled to try to do everything. And I call that the shotgun approach for training for climbing, and it doesn't work. If you're going to the gym trying to do everything, that's a pretty ineffective way to train. And there's some phenomena that we could get into, but people go to the gym and do a lot of everything, and initially they get better. And they're like, oh, wow, doing a lot of everything may be better, so I'm going to do even more of everything. And then they stop getting better and they end up getting injured. And what's going on there is, if you're new to climbing or your first few years of climbing, if you go to the climbing gym and do anything, it'll make you get better. If you just tie into the rope and climb or just boulder, you will get better. So because you are also lifting weights and doing X and Y and Z at the same time, you can't conclude that X and Y and Z actually helped you climb better. It was just the fact you were going to the gym and climbing that made you better. Do you kind of get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So, you're doing, the 80-20 rule is a good one to apply. I think you get 80% of the benefits out of about 20% of the things you do in the name of training. And so I often challenge people that I work with and myself. I look in the mirror and say, hey, every year, you need to be reinventing your training and asking yourself what things need to be removed that aren't really helping you out or maybe hurting you. Maybe things that are making you sore or tempting injury that need removed from your program. And the goal should be to train smarter and ideally do a fewer number of things that will be impactful and to eliminate the things that just create fatigue. Because creating fatigue doesn't make you a better climber. Creating fatigue is part of the training process, but just because exercise creates fatigue doesn't mean it's making you a better climber. And so it needs to not only be somewhat specific to training, but it needs to address your personal weaknesses and constraints. And hence, it's pretty clear when you think about it that training for climbing is actually a pretty complex thing. For a beginner, it's not. You just need to climb. You need to learn the skills. But the more advanced you become and the more years you're involved in climbing, the more nuanced the program needs to be, the more personalized the program needs to be. And so just copying what's in some training video or what you see on some Instagram post or some cookie cutter program you downloaded off a website or my website or whatnot, or it's good to study that material, but it doesn't mean it's the right thing for you. And so I'm a big fan of engaging for climbers. You can study these things and over the course of many years, learn to self-coach at a very high level. A lot of climbers do it amazingly, but there's also a lot of climbers that do a poor job of self-coaching and they end up injured or getting lackluster results. And that's where a very experienced coach, someone with a decade or more of coaching under their belt, can really be a game changer because they can look at what you're doing based on not only the science of training and climbing, but based on their wealth of experience. And like a sage veteran doctor diagnosing a patient with some rare disease, a veteran coach, again, somebody with a decade or 2 or 3 decades of coaching under their belt, they've seen so much, they worked with so many climbers that they can really pinpoint more precisely for an individual, maybe what needs to be done to open up the next grade. And there's a lot of information out there, a lot of enthusiastic people getting involved in coaching climbing, and that's terrific. I'm a fan of it all, but you, in 2 years of becoming a coach, you don't have that experience of a veteran coach like a Robin Erbesfeld or Udo Newman, or you could name many other veteran coaches that have been around for decades. And you want to seek out those types of people if you can, because they are the ones with that vast experience that can help steer you. So again, the longer a person is involved in climbing, 5, 10, 15 years, your program needs to be more and more nuanced and refined to continue to get results. And of course, at the same time, the intensity has to go up if you're going to climb higher grades. But you can't just take a shotgun approach. You need the opposite of that. You need a laser-like approach that is, the target of which you're aiming at is something that a veteran coach has diagnosed as being your needs.
Yeah, all that's really helpful. I want to focus in on a point you made a few minutes ago. You were talking about how it's almost more difficult now because we have so much information. We're drowning in this fire hose of information that's coming at us, and I certainly relate to that. I'm someone who has been really curious about training for quite some time. I've read a lot about it. I can see when I think about this shotgun approach idea, that's something I've certainly struggled with. I read an article or I hear anecdotes about using a hangboard, and I can see that, oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It's likely very helpful for my climbing, and yet I've never met anyone who's hangboarded their way to 514. I could say the same thing about the deadlift. Like the deadlift, I can see how that would help, but I have yet to meet someone who's deadlifted their way to 514. Same thing with the rings or with kettlebells or any other of these training implements. But I have met a lot of people who have climbed their way to 514 without doing anything else. So I'd love to dig into, thinking about this 80-20, what is the 20% that you come back to, with people? And maybe it depends on the person, and we can dig into that. But how do you think about using those supplemental tools along with just climbing these days? Like, how are you thinking about fitting all that together?
Yeah. Well, first of all, talking about the 80-20 rule, where 80% of the gains come from just 20% of the exercises, I'm speaking there to the things we do physically, like when you go to the gym, like exercises, whether it's hangboarding or campusing. And, there's a myriad of exercises you can choose from, but there's only a small handful that really make a difference. You could walk into a CrossFit gym and do all these different CrossFit exercises a few days per week, and it would generate a tremendous amount of fatigue, and you might feel badass and you might get stronger, but it's not going to make you a better climber. Going to a climbing gym and climbing, as you alluded to, you need to climb. Climbing is a skill sport, and it's not just technical skill, it's mental skill. I mean, as important as footwork and sequence and movement efficiency are, the same thing comes, when the mental domain, the ability to relax at certain times and the ability to get intense at certain times and be focused and to challenge fears. And, everybody talks about trying harder, but there's some routes that you almost need a try softer approach on. So if it's a max boulder route or a burly crux move or something, committing, yes, you trying harder, that mindset helps, but there can be a delicate route or a resistance route that a try softer approach where you're more stealth and grip the hold softer and move more efficiently and rest, get all these, rest, all of those mental and technical skills you can improve at for decades. I just learned a knee bar 5 years ago, climber of 40 years. And I just learned to how to use knee bars. Now I love knee bars. It's game changing for me as an older climber that I can get these knee scums or knee bars and rest in positions that I never knew how to do before. And so this is a sport where you just through learning, refining movement skills and learning new techniques and pressing out your mental game, you can continue to improve, even if you've kind of maxed out physically. We all have genetic constraints that we will come up against at some point. And through a really, nuanced training program, you can continue to get stronger for many years as a climber. But most of your strength gains come in the first few years of climbing and first few years of training for climbing. And then after that, you are going to just eke out a few percent per year, maybe, if you're lucky. But the mental and technical aspects, you can also eke out a few percent per year or more. And so there lies the potential to continue to improve for many years or decades. Climbing is a sport where, injury aside, assuming you don't get injured and assuming you don't lose motivation, you will probably climb harder 20 years into the sport than at any time earlier. People like, just to pick out some pro climbers, Chris Sharma, or, he's just turned 40. And Adam Andra, who's soon going to turn 30, he can continue to improve for another 5 or 10 years, I'm sure. And so to a more regular person listening to this podcast, there's huge potential to continue to improve as long as you remain open-minded. And there's no single tool that is going to get you there. Not the hangboard and not the system wall and not the campus board. If you become obsessed on one thing, that is when, first of all, injury often rears its ugly head, but also you may end up digressing as a climber. If you put all your eggs into one basket, thinking that is the answer to the next grade, again, you need to do more than just get strong. In fact, my sons, who are now 18 and 20 and out of the house, they're young adults now, but they grew up in a house with a climbing coach. And, I've heard all of my little sayings over all these years. And the one saying I'm fond of the last couple of years in talking to my sons about training and climbing is that, and I say it something like this: Cameron, your fingers are strong enough right now to climb the next grade. Or Jonathan, you are strong enough right now to climb the next grade. That's Dad, Eric, as my sons are obsessing over, they need to have more grip strength. I need to measure more grip strength. And I'm like, dude, you've got enough grip strength to climb 15A. It's other stuff you need to do. Your core needs to be stronger. You need to climb more. My sons were multi-sport athletes growing up. So they didn't climb 12 months of the year. They climbed 6 months of the year. So they're kind of behind on the whole experience thing. And so them just climbing more is going to open up that next grade. They are strong. And I would propose that most people listening to this podcast are strong enough to climb the next grade. So if they want to level up, it's not more hangboard training and not more deadlifting that's going to get them there. It's going to be probably some other stuff that they need to do. And it might be technical and mental because their fingers may already be strong enough. And so again, everybody's different and everybody needs to be assessed and be properly prescribed a training program. But that's the stuff of a veteran coach. It's obviously not something you can do over the internet.
That actually makes me want to ask another listener question. I have a question from Matt that feels relevant right now, and I'll read his whole comment. He wrote, I highly respect Eric Hörst for his countless knowledge and wisdom on training for climbing. It's one of the reasons I was able to sport climb 12A. So my question for Eric would be, what should an average person, an average climber, look for in a coach? What are some of the do's and don'ts of hiring a climbing coach? Do you have any thoughts on that, in addition to what you just shared?
Yeah, it depends on the climber, I would say. Okay, if you're someone new to the sport, let's say in your first 3 years of climbing, the coaching that is needed is nothing, that high end and nothing that novel or scientific or advanced. In your first, 3 to 5 years as a climber, it's a pretty basic mission that you're on. And so I would say most climbing gyms probably have a coach who has enough experience and knowledge to guide that person. And there's a lot of internet coaches now, people that are new to it, maybe their first few years of coaching, that would work that would be great to help out that newer climber. Again, the person, in, let's say, the first 3 to 5 years, because the coaching mission is fairly basic. So hopefully the coach can get it right. But it's as the climber becomes more advanced, when they start coming up on like V double digits, let's say, V8, V10, or trying to get from 12A to 13A or 13A to 14A, or trying to go from being, a local competition winner to a regional or national level competition winner. That is where you need that more veteran coach who has this wealth of knowledge, hopefully, evidence-based largely, but also heavily experiential, based on having worked with hundreds or thousands of athletes. And there's no replacement for that experience. And so somebody who's new in coaching, they've only been doing it a year or two, can't possibly, and they might be really smart and really sharp and be able to do a fine job coaching a beginner. There's just no way they are going to have the knowledge that, a Robin Erbsfeld-Rabbatu has, who's been coaching climbers every day for the last, 20 plus years. And so the more advanced you are and the higher your goals are, the more you should seek out one of those, more rare coaches, those more veteran coaches that have a good understanding of both the science and just raw experience, having worked with so many climbers and having kind of seen everything. Because, I like to, I've written in my books and articles over the years, kind of the whole snowflake principle, no two snowflakes are the same. Well, no two climbers, nor no two climbers training programs are the same. And so the whole cookie cutter program might work in the early stages, go to the gym and climb for an hour and then do these few exercises. And that can work for a period of time, that very basic program. But again, the more advanced you are, you need to address the uniqueness of the snowflake or of the individual and of their, limitations. And so just saying, do more hangboarding or do this deadlifting isn't going to make a difference. And it could arguably be counterproductive or get you injured, if it's not what you need, or, if it's being done in wrong doses or too frequently. Time spent resting is just as important as time spent training. And so, a good coach ought to be hopefully communicating that balance and the role of nutrition. I mean, there's so many things that go into generating an effective training for climbing program. And the more important climbing is to you and the more advanced you become, the more that nuance needs to be had.
Yeah, your point there is really well taken. But with that, I mean, you are very good at distilling things to general principles that we can all apply, and you do that very well in your books. And I'd love to dig into that. I mean, you've written Training for Climbing. How many editions are there now? You said there's fourth edition is?
The fourth edition came out a few years ago. And, I have been updating that book every 5 to 8 years, depending on my time to update it. And the science is moving quickly. And so like the last edition, I really, when it was published in 2016, I laid out kind of the state of the art then on energy system training, how to apply that to training for climbing, which is totally overboard and too much information for a beginner climber. But for a more advanced climber, there's a tremendous value in understanding the bioenergetic systems at work and how to target specific energy systems based on your genetics and based on your climbing goals and your current strengths and weaknesses. There's a lot of rich value there for a more advanced climber. So trying to update and include, new emerging topics or relevant, one of the things that I need to update in the next edition relates to connective tissue training and tendon training. This is something that I've done podcasts on and I've written some articles on the last few years. And now there's some other coaches and clinicians kind of getting on board and agreeing that, when you go to the gym, you're not just training your muscles, you're actually training your connective tissues. And so that's a whole new paradigm there. The old school was, that your connective tissues, your tendons, let's say, ligaments, are kind of set in stone when you finish puberty, and they change little through life beyond that, other than a slow degrade as you get older, and that the muscles are where all the training adaptations are occurring. But in reality, we now know from research that there's as much protein turnover in your tendons as there are in your muscles from high load training. And so for a climber, that should be like sit up on your chair and say, wait a minute, that maybe that's why my tendons are sore all the time, is because there's this stimulus, not just to my muscles, but actually to my tendons as well. And I need to let the tendons recover and adapt, just like you need to let your muscles recover and adapt. And, so it's a really rich topic that we can't go down that rabbit hole here, but that's something that I've done a lot of research and studying on, and I've actually done a couple, talks at research conferences on. And I need to update my Training for Climbing book to explain that topic much more. And again, for a beginner, it's TMI, but for a more advanced climber, it's like should be the bullseye of your target. Is the role that training plays in remodeling, stiffening, and strengthening your connective tissues. And I think you look at an elite climber like an Alex Megos, and it's probably connective tissue adaptations occurring within his body more than muscle adaptations that are making him more powerful year over year. Mm-hmm. Obviously, you're training the entire system, but I'm just saying that the connective tissue adaptations are something that are very slow, remarkably slow, that happen over the course of years, not much shorter time spans. And so that's a rich topic for more advanced climbers and for higher end coaches to get to study and get more up to speed on.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, I'm tempted to dive down the rabbit hole, even though you just said it's too much to tackle. But I just want to ask one general question about that. I'm just curious, generally speaking, we don't have to go into the details here. We can save it for another time. But does that knowledge and the awareness of targeting our connective tissues over muscular adaptations, does that have a practical implication for how we approach our training or our climbing? Is it 100%. Changing the way you're programming sessions and things like that?
100%. Yes. And by the way, I did 4 podcasts, I think 2 years ago. So people will have to scroll back in the Training for Climbing podcast a couple of years.
I'll find them and I'll put them in the show notes. Yeah.
Yeah. Do that. Yeah. One of them's called like sinew training, and one of them is called like a revolution in training, because it was just new information that nobody had heard back then. And I had climbers from around the world emailing me going, "Oh my God, Eric, this topic, I've not heard it before." And now people are starting to talk about it. Tyler Nelson in Salt Lake City is doing a great job starting to communicate, especially with regard to injury recovery, the value of, thinking more in terms of connective tissue training. But to give something actionable here, just in a nutshell, to answer your question, how is this relevant? Well, let's take 2 different finger training exercises, one being isometric hangs on a hangboard, and the other being campus training, where you're, let's say, laddering up the campus board, or you're doing double dynos on a campus board. Both exercises are training the same finger flexor muscles and the same tendons that, attach to the bones in your fingers. And for that matter, the ligament pulleys, the A2 pulley, the infamous A2 pulley, they're all being stressed. They're all, through the loading of those 2 exercises. However, when it comes to the adaptations that result from those 2 different exercises, they're markedly different. And let me explain it this way. Connective tissues, tendons connect contractile fibers, your muscles, to the bone, and pass the force that the muscles create to the bone to, crimp that hold, to pull that pocket, to grab that, jug. When you're doing a hangboard exercise, like let's say you're doing a 12-second max hang, or maybe you're doing 7-3 repeaters and doing many sets. Those isometric exercises, when it comes to the tendons and ligaments in your fingers, that isometric loading actually, it's good for improving tendon density. It turns on the tenocytes that extrude collagen and help tendons and ligaments slowly remodel and become stronger and actually over years thicker. But those isometric hangs break crosslinks. The collagen in your tendons is aligned directionally, so lengthwise, to pass that force from the muscles to the bones. But connecting the fascicles, the collagen fibers, are crosslinks. They're enzymatic crosslinks. And the crosslinks stiffen the system. Think of the rafters of a roof, how it has cross bracing, those X's of 2x4s. What's that do? That adds stiffness to the rafters. Well, in the same way, these enzymatic crosslinks that form between between the collagen fibers add stiffness to the tendons. So when you're doing isometric hangs, you're breaking crosslinks. You're actually making the system more lax. And it's very subtle, but you're making the tendons a little more stretchy. That is exactly what you want to do for tendon health. Like if you are someone that struggles with tendonitis, a PT or a good coach will have you do isometric training, isometric loads, because it helps make the tendons more compliant by breaking those crosslinks. And that reduces stress on the system and can actually make it more healthy. But for performance, if you need to sprint fast, or if you need to lunge or grab a hold fast, we're talking about rate of force development, you actually want a stiffer system. And it's plyometric exercises that make the system stiffer. Because when you're doing plyometric jumps, where you're having these explosive contractions, or when you're 7-9ing up the campus board or whatever, doing your double dynos on the campus board, those plyometric contractions that are virtually instantaneous. You're only contracting for 3 or 5 milliseconds, and then you're off, then you're done contracting. You don't break crosslinks. In fact, your body adapts to those exercises by making more crosslinks. You have a net gain in crosslinks from plyometric training, whereas you have a net loss of crosslinks from isometric training. So whereas isometric training makes the system more compliant and potentially more healthful, campus training and plyometric type exercises, power exercises, make the system stiffer, which means you can apply force more quickly and there's less force lost in the transmission from the contractile fibers in the muscles to the bone. And if you get the force there more completely and more quickly, you express more power on the rock. Well, that's exactly the stuff of V15 bouldering or 515 climbing, is being able to express high, power movements. And so two different exercises that both train the finger flexors and the tendons, the flexor tendons. One is hangboarding and one is campus training, have two markedly different results on the connective tissues. And so for a healthy climber seeking performance, you actually want to do more exercises that are brief and near maximal. Things like 3 to 5 second max hangs that don't break crosslinks as much, and the campus boarding and the system walling and the hard bouldering, things that are more power oriented. Whereas the climber that is more achy, or perhaps injured or recovering from injury or trying to avoid injury because they have a predisposition to injury, they should do less of that plyometric training, perhaps none, and do mostly these slow, isometric exercises that have benefits for both the muscles getting stronger, but also the tendons getting more compliant and therefore less prone to injury. And again, it's a really rich topic that's hard to communicate and boil down to a nutshell, but I just maybe gave enough there to give a little bit of understanding. And I have 3 or 4 hours of podcasts dedicated to this material that I did a few years ago that need updated because there's new research to leverage as well. But if people want to begin their study, they could visit those older podcasts.
Yeah, that's just incredible. Thanks so much for sharing that. I do want to ask one follow-up question there. I feel like I have to. For the climber, and of course I'm always thinking of myself with these questions, but for a climber who wants to focus on performance and is, based on everything you just said, feels drawn to that tendon stiffening approach, how do you think about balancing that with like resiliency? I mean, I also want to make sure that I'm continuing to bulletproof my fingers, so to speak, or prevent any finger issue. Like, do I cycle them back and forth? Can I get 100%. The benefits of both? Okay.
100%. Yeah, exactly. So what you would do is during your off-season training, now climbing is a unique sport that potentially it has no off-season, but like in a conventional sport, like, track and field or football or whatnot, you have a season. And so during your off-season, you're trying to gain strength and health. And so you would focus more on those high load exercises that are slow and controlled, that you can open up a new level of strength potentially with a hangboard program, let's say, but also make yourself more resilient and healthy by not over stiffening the system. And so you would do a training phase during your off season. And then as you approach your performance season, whether it's your first climbing trip of the year or whether it's a World Cup, the first World Cup event of the year or whatnot, you would then make the program more dynamic and have more plyometric training exercises over the course of like the last 2 months heading into that performance season. And there's a lot more that would need adjusted as well. That's the art of exercise prescription, is being able to, how to adjust and schedule everything in terms of intensity and volume. But just with regard to the sinew training, the tendon training idea, you would do more the isometric and, the training that improves the health of the system during the off season. And then as you head towards the on season, you want to train in a way that will maximize performance. And that means stiffening the system. And if you do too much of stiffening too long, that's when injuries begin to happen. A lot of people have experienced, they get hooked on the campus board and they get great results the first few weeks. And then after doing the same campus board training and escalating the campus board training, after a few months, they end up with a pulley injury or a forearm injury of some kind, and so the campus board turns into an injury board, an implement of injury. And, that's from doing too much of that type of training. So it's got to be the proper dose, the minimum effective dose. And there has to be an arc to your training and as you mentioned, a cycling of your training. But heading into performance season, you would do things to stiffen the system. A good example of this, by the way, is every year they have the NFL Combine, where they take the top college football players and they go to the combine and they get timed on all these key performance indicators, like the 40-yard dash. And so those athletes, they finish up their senior year of football, and then they spend the next 6 months training for the combine. Well, they spend the first 4 months, let's say, building out their strength, stronger legs for sprinting, heavy lifting and squats and whatever, is obviously specific training to sprinting. And then the last month or two before the combine, they switch to doing more plyometric type training and actual sprints that stiffen the system. And their goal is to arrive at the NFL Combine event with this system that's been tightened down like a sports car, a very stiff suspension, and they can express, peak force and ground reaction forces to run the fastest ever 40-yard dash time. And what ends up happening every year at that combine is a few of the guys get injured. They get hamstring pulls or other injuries, or in the weeks following the combine, they go to their first NFL training camp and they get injured because the system has been made so stiff with the goal of peak performance in mind that they actually ended up getting injured. And so there is such a thing as being too stiff, but it's all it's all relative to the health of your muscles, your whole system. And so again, no two athletes are the same. And so you can't prescribe two climbers the same campus board program any more than you could prescribe to two climbers or two football players the same sprinting program. It needs to be personalized to both optimize results, but hopefully avoid injury. And again, for an elite level climber, that nuanced training is going to require a veteran coach.
Well, that's really interesting. When you were describing the longer duration hangs, either max hangs or doing repeaters or something for a month, and then leading that into campusing, just as an example, immediately what came to mind is Mike and Mark Anderson's program. That's something that I've done a few cycles of, the Rock Climbers Training Manual.
Sure.
Periodization program where they have some other stuff first. You do some arcing, but then you have this focused month of hangboarding leading into more campusing and limit bouldering. So that's really interesting. Whether they were aware of the cross links and the stiffening of the tendons or not, that's effectively what they were having people do in that program. And I'm curious how you think about that kind of a periodization approach versus what's becoming more and more common now, this nonlinear approach to climbing training, where
right.
A lot of coaches are integrating some strength, some power, some endurance or energy system work within the same week and just building on that week on week. I actually got a question about this from Liam. He would like to know what Eric thinks about nonlinear training programs. Why does he like linear? Do you have thoughts on that? Do you have a preference or?
Yeah, well, that's actually not really correct. I mean, I have prescribed many different types of programs in my books. You open up Training for Climbing, I talk about the DUP, Daily Undulating Periodization, which is a nonlinear training regime, which I actually in the book say it's probably the way to go for a more advanced climber who is climbing a lot, that has kind of that never-ending climbing season, where you are over the course of a week hitting each energy system and doing some different types of training throughout the training week. There's great value in that for a newer climber or somebody getting started or somebody that has a glaring weakness. A more conventional training program, linear program, can be beneficial as well, where you go through kind of the cycles as you described the Anderson brothers, program, which I think they described a longer cycle that might be 14 or 16 weeks. My cycles that I prescribe for climbers are typically more like 7 to 10 weeks, but it can be effective both ways. But again, if you're a year-round climber, then it's tougher to put in a 10-week or 16-week training block. If you have a trip or a competition right in the middle of it, that wouldn't work so well. And so that's where kind of these nonlinear schemes are more valuable. But again, it has to be properly matched to the individual. And again, every individual has unique strengths and weaknesses. And also other things like their age or their loading history, their injury history, all those things need to be accounted for. Myself being an older climber, always kind of fearing injury because, as you get older, your connective tissues actually get stiffer. They form a bad type of crosslinks that relate to aging that, you can't really get rid of. It's one reason, older people are more stiff and less fluid in their walking even, let's say, is that you get stiffer. And so me as a 57-year-old climber, I have to worry about injury a lot more than my sons do at age 18 and 20. And so I do campusing in very small doses, and I do a lot more of the isometric hangboard training. There's more value there and less risk. And so everything has to be, in its proper balance. And again, a climber in their 20s or 30s, might have, let me give you another example that I often prescribe. Again, with my sons, I'm telling them, is something they need to work on. And so often climbers don't realize they have a limiting constraint that they're totally unaware of. And it could be mental, technical, physical, but most often in the physical, there's a limiting constraint that they're not training at all. And here's one that with the case of both of my sons, and I think myself, is end range strength. If you think about your pulling muscles, we all do these different types of pull-ups. You can do them on all different types of tools and apparatus. But if you're doing pull-ups, you're accelerating and momentum is kind of taking you into the top position. And then you go right back down and you repeat it. So whether you're doing one-arm pull-ups or two-arm pull-ups, you're generating, the most difficult part is getting started, the beginning of the range of motion. And then momentum kind of takes you into the top of the range of motion. And consequently, you don't develop strength in that end range. Like think about the lock-off position of a pull-up. Or think about on a climb, oftentimes you don't just pull in a hold, you actually bring it down underneath your armpit, like next to your chest, that really low lock-off. What are you doing to train that? All those pull-ups aren't doing it. All those one-arm pull-ups aren't doing it. All that campus training isn't doing it so much unless you're really strong and can drive a campus rung down to your hip like Matt Foltz can or Kyra Condie can. You're not, most people aren't able to really train that end range strength, but it is so important on hard routes when the holds get farther and farther apart. That end range strength can be kind of a blind weakness that you're not aware of. And so you consequently need a specific exercise to direct that. There's different ways to do it with different tools and, lock-offs, and I don't want to get into it, but just the simple idea, just because, my son Cameron can do 10 one-arm pull-ups. He can do a one-arm pull-up with a 40-pound dumbbell on his other hand. He's really strong. Jeez. But the ability to lock off and press down on a hold isn't being trained by doing one-arm pull-ups with a 40-pound dumbbell on the other hand. So there's something missing there that, even though he's really strong. And again, you need to have that perspective, that a veteran coach can provide in that assessment. And hopefully, can identify personally what is your limiting constraint. And it's never just one thing. It's, again, designing a training program, it's like, if you're doing it right, it's like 3D chess because you have to coach not only, and decipher what is the physical limitation of an individual, what is holding them back from achieving the next grade. But you also have to be able to assess their movement skills. You have to be able to try to uncover their psychology, and what might be limiting them. And very often that internal voice that a climber has, the way they talk to themselves, can be their biggest weakness. I've often written in my book that, those mental weaknesses that we all have, it might be fear of falling. It might be, fear of failure, embarrassment. There's a lot of different mental issues a climber could potentially have. They can be like adding a 10-pound weight, an invisible 10-pound weight belt around your body, that you're hauling up every climb and every boulder because there's these psychological issues that are holding you back. So again, very often it's not stronger fingers that are the answer. It's something more nebulous that needs to be uncovered and worked on.
Yeah. Yeah. A good coach almost has to be a therapist to some extent.
Yeah. And yes. And I'll tell you, that's what these rare veteran coaches are really good at. And they may not have a degree in exercise science or a sports psychology, but they have 20 or 30 years of working with athletes, day in and day out. And therefore they have this knowledge that encompasses all of those areas. And so, no, they're not a sports psychologist, but they really understand the mindset of hard climbing and can communicate that to the climber and coach that. And so they're able to, I think that's what I do. Like if somebody picks up a copy of Training for Climbing, there's only one chapter on finger training, but there's 10 other chapters that cover the full gamut. And that's because, it's not one thing that's going to help you become a better climber and stay uninjured over the long term. It's doing a lot of things, a lot of little things right, and avoiding some common pitfalls. And I guess that's one thing I kind of pride myself on is over my 30 years of coaching and studying research and literature and networking with other coaches around the world, I've tried to become knowledgeable in all of these other areas. So do I have the knowledge of a sports psychologist? No, not to that caliber. Do I have the knowledge of a Olympic weight coach? Nope, not to the same level. Do I have the movement knowledge of a specialist, movement coach? Nope. But what I do have is a very high degree of knowledge in all of these different areas. And so if you go to a strength coach, they're going to prescribe a strength training program that you will be convinced is going to be the difference maker. And if you go to a sports psychologist, they will give you a psychology program that they will say will be the difference maker. If you go to a nutritionist, they will give you nutritional guidance and a program and foods to eat and not eat and all that stuff. That is the magic bullet. But in reality, none of them are magic bullets. You need to actually be doing well in all of those areas. And so I think that's kind of what I've tried to bring to the sport through my books or through my podcast, is that I cover this, kind of A to Z of climbing performance. And there are probably experts in any individual area that is better than me. I certainly am imperfect in my coaching. I'm always striving to be curious and do better. But I think, this wealth of knowledge that I've accumulated in all of the relevant topics is what I uniquely bring to the sport. And the ability, like you said, to distill it down to actionable items for the climber. Yeah,
that's great. I mean, combining all those things, it really does seem like this force multiplier where it's not just the sum of the parts. There's some exponential factors going on there.
Yeah. I mean, I did a podcast a few months ago about how, climbers we spend so much time strengthening our fingers because it's the obvious thing to do. And now there's all this technology, where you can measure your finger force. And so you can get obsessed on measuring finger force. And then you become obsessed on how can I increase that finger force month over month to the point that you're measuring it every time you go to the gym. And so it's like your goal, you're not a climber anymore. You're just someone trying to train for higher finger force. And there's so many other things that affect climbing. And like I said about my sons, for them to fully utilize the finger force they need to have a strong core. I don't think there's any climber out there that couldn't benefit from a stronger core. And I'm not just talking about doing one exercise for core, but a variety of exercises to make your kind of a comprehensive core training program. Because applying finger force on the rock, especially overhanging rock, demands a strong core. It's all about connecting your fingertips and toes. And just like stiffening a sports car, connecting the front wheels and the back wheels with a stiffer suspension to apply force to the ground more quickly, a climber, you can have strong fingers and strong toes, but if the suspension is compliant, if you've got spaghetti between the fingers and toes, you can't apply much force. But if you have steel between the fingers and toes, you can apply the force in a very meaningful way. And so again, that's something actionable. I think every person listening to this podcast, including you and me, Stephen, could do a better job at stiffening our core, through appropriate training. And I spent 30 years just kind of giving lip service to my own personal core training.
Interesting.
Yeah, I would do 3 different things. And I'm like, well, I can do a front lever. My core is strong enough. And a front lever is just like one aspect of core training. And your toes aren't connecting to anything. So it's not even all that climbing specific. It's a great party trick. You know,
It is. It's badass.
yeah, but there's a lot more to core training. So, you know, that's one of my own flawed ways of thinking where, you know, 20 years ago, I thought, hey, because I can do a front lever and hold it for 10 seconds, my core is strong enough. I was wrong. And I lost 20 years of training core because of that false belief system. And so all of us have those limiting belief systems, you know, where we falsely believe that one thing is the answer or that we're good enough at this other thing. And those can be our biggest limiting constraints. And so why, again, a good coach is going to spend up, you know, I'm good friends with Alex Megos's coaches, Patrick and Dickie. And, you know, when I got to know those guys and kind of dug into how they have trained Alex over the last 12 years, it became very clear to me that they were training a human being, not a machine. They were training, you know, a person who had this whole life, you know, that yes, climbing was very important to, but they had to, you know, address all the things that that individual was dealing with in their life, whether it's school or family or relationships. All of those things have kind of a invisible role they play in your training program and just like your, you know, how you think and operate, how effective you are as an individual. And so while a person might come into Cafe Craft in Nuremberg and see Patrick or Dickie with Alex at the campus board or on the spray wall doing some specific drill or exercise, that you're seeing, you might conclude that that is the magic. Mm-hmm. No, that's not the magic. It's just one piece of this large puzzle, this tapestry that they've painted in working with Alex for 12 years. And, you know, again, that is the, you know, for the beginning level climber, you don't need that level of coaching, but the more advanced you become and the more important climbing is and reaching your climbing goals are, you need to seek out and find individuals that you can work with long-term, not just buy a program for a month, but work with, you know, over the long term that really gets to know who you are and know a lot more than just what your finger force is. Anybody can test finger force and give you a fingerboard training program. That doesn't take much of a coach. But it's all that other stuff that becomes more and more meaningful with every passing year that someone is in the sport. And that's why I've largely stopped working with climbers, you know, because I just don't have the time to do it right. And in certain cases, I will do consults, but I lay out up front that, you know, if you're really going to get good coaching, you need to work with somebody personally. I'm a big believer in that, especially at the higher levels.
But that's, yeah, all of that's just fantastic. I have to ask a question about your own core training now. That's so interesting to hear you say you feel like you lost 20 years. And, you know, there's so much talk about hangboarding and finger training, and I think there's plenty of information out there, probably too much. But I think a lot of climbers get it. You know, maybe some supplemental finger training along with just hard bouldering is going to get your fingers as strong as they need to be. But I do still see a lot of people just kind of floundering around as far as core training goes. You know, there's a lot of people still just wrapping up their climbing session with 15-minute abs and just going until they're feel like they're going to throw up and they have all this burn in their abs from crunches and whatever else. And then on the flip side, you have some people doing real strength movements like deadlifts or ring training or things like that. But I've certainly gotten lost in the weeds on that side of things, and, you know, had this period where I got a lot of benefit from the deadlift and really saw it affect my bouldering in a positive way. And then before I knew it, I was like reading about training programs for improving my deadlift. I was doing like supplemental training just to get better at the deadlift, and I'd kind of lost the plot there. So yeah. I guess I'd love to hear, you know, what are some of the things that you wish you had started doing 20 years ago, or what are some of the things you're doing now to focus on relevant, specific core strength for climbing, or maybe what are you having your sons doing? You can kind of tackle that any way you'd like. Right. But yeah, I'd love to hear how you're thinking about core training for climbing. Yeah, well,
my old way of thinking, which I think was very flawed and held me back, was that you could do one or two things. And so me as a gymnast in high school, I learned to do a front lever and an iron cross in high school. And though I can't do an iron cross anymore, I can still do a front lever. So all those years, I equated being able to do a front lever with having a strong enough core to climb hard. And I also equated like knocking out 100 crunches at the end of the workout, as you mentioned, many people do that because it's like a basic core exercise, as being good as well, because it would like create fatigue. And like if you do 100 or 200 crunches with good form, you get kind of the ab equivalent of a pump, you get sore there, sore and crampy there. And so you do that and you do some front levers and it's easy to convince yourself, hey, that was a hell of a core workout.
Yeah.
But really you just trained two things that actually aren't very climbing specific. Like I said, the front lever, though there are moves on a boulder or a roof that you might hold a front lever type position. If you're climbing right, most of the time you have your hands and feet, your fingers and toes on the rock, and you're using your core in a different way than the front lever. And same thing with crunching. How often do you crunch on a route? You might pull your knees back up after your feet cut off, but that's hip flexors as much as it is your abs. And so, crunching arguably is not even good for your spine, if you do it in high doses for many years. And so, I was kind of off target there on my own training and the training that I was prescribing. But I course corrected, of course, as I'm not afraid to admit when I'm wrong and correct things. And, so Training for Climbing 4th edition, which came out in 2016, I did most of the writing in 2015. I put in a whole chapter on utilizing, doing more comprehensive type core training. And the one thing that I put in the book and that I was doing and my family was doing was deadlifting. Now you can't deadlift like a power lifter and you can't deadlift like a CrossFitter and you can't deadlift like a bodybuilder. You have to deadlift like a climber because you don't want to put on all this mass on your lower body. That will be counterproductive. And it is. Anybody who says it's not is lying to you. You want to get stronger without putting on mass. And you can do that by strengthening the nervous system and, the connective tissues getting slowly stiffer. You can develop, posterior chain strength from deadlifting without gaining weight. Now, genetics play a role. Some people do respond with weight gain. Others, if they're on the right program, don't. But, in that 4th edition of Training for Climbing, I put in a section on, deadlifting for weight training. And I think I was the first coach that I know of that was prescribing it, in 2015. But now a lot of coaches, are prescribing deadlifting, and hopefully low rep, high weight deadlifts with good form. It's an exercise that has to be done with proper form or you can get injured. And so deadlifting, again, it's not a magic bullet, but it's one of maybe 5 or 6 different exercises that you want to think about training total core. Your core is all the way around your torso. Think of everything between your shoulders and your hips as being core. So crunches address your abdominals, just one portion of the core. The front lever, more pecs, scapular stabilizer, shoulders, kind of that upper core. Deadlift is more posterior chain, though your whole core tightens down. You have to create tremendous stiffness, in your torso to keep your, spine properly aligned. But it's more of a posterior chain exercise, training hamstrings and glutes and spinal erectors and such. So cobbling together 5 or 6 exercises. Another one that I'm a huge fan of is planking, and not just doing these bodyweight planks, but progressing to doing weighted planks. I did a plank as part of my workout last night, and I put on a 16-pound weight belt and did a 6-minute plank sequence. Freaking hard. That's a hard sequence to do. And it's easy to get sloppy and have bad form as you fatigue. And so you got to be disciplined to call it quits when your form degrades. Any exercise, especially rigorous near limit type exercises, should be done with proper form and then ended when form can't be maintained. But doing those types of weighted planks it was game changing for me the last season or two. And I still have a long way to go. I have a lot of ground to make up, and I'll probably never make up the lost ground of, training poorly in that area over those years. And there's a lot of climbers, also, nobody's training perfectly. Your goal every year should be to try to do things better, cut away some ineffective things and add some things that are more relevant and more effective. And so for me, It was, adding more variety, adding a few new core exercises that I had not done before. And I feel the difference on the rock for sure, as you said you did, when you did some core training. So there's no single exercise, whether you're talking about finger training or core training, you can't just think that there's this magic bullet exercise or approach. Again, the 3D chess analogy is perfect because that's what playing climbing performance is. It's 3D chess.
Yeah, that's that's great. And I want to clarify. I mean, I did eventually get too far into the weeds with the deadlifting and kind of lose the plot. But I had a season, I think it was a winter training cycle, where I was deadlifting really like easy strength style, minimal effective dose, maybe 2 or 3 days a week, but I think I was doing either 3 sets of 2 or 2 sets of 3, really low volume, higher weight. And I was combining that with a lot of steep bouldering. just a couple days a week, but really high quality bouldering sessions. And I had a home wall at the time that I had built, and I was really setting a lot of hard boulder problems with small in-cut feet where you really had to keep your toe on as you did longer moves. Yep. A lot of tension. And so I think I was able to build some strength through deadlifting in the posterior chain and then apply it to the climbing wall week on week. And when I went on this trip to Bishop, after a couple months of that, I've never felt stronger in my ability to drive through a toe on a steep wall. And it really was amazing. But
yeah, that was really smart of you, Stephen, because, one issue I also had, and my sons had, is we train mostly at home here. We have a home wall and a tread wall and all these other tools. If you go to a gym, go look at their spray wall or, the moon board or, system wall of any type. The problems are dynamic. They're big moves. They're relatively good holds. And so you end up climbing generally with good feet. When you're in a climbing gym, the holds stick out from the wall and they tend to be mostly large holds. If you really want to train your core, you want not only small fingers, but you want small feet. And so what you described, where you had the small footholds that you had to toe down on, that really engages the posterior chain. And so that is part of a good core training program, is actually seeking out, or if you have a home wall setting, traverses or boulder routes that have small feet. Or here's something novel, set a route with medium-sized hands and small feet. And so instead of obsessing on the arm and hand movements, make the purpose of the exercise not training your grip and your upper body, but the purpose of the exercise being training that toe down and that posterior chain stiffness. And along the same ways, separate the hands and feet. You get on a moonboard problem. There's a lot of like lunging and then high stepping and, but it's when your hands and feet are far apart, like when you're reaching over your head, but have your legs extending to near the straight position, that core stiffness is most important. When you're all compressed in a box, your core is more lax by necessity. But when you're stretched out on a boulder or on a movement, the stiffness is critical. And so again, as a method of training on the wall, problems with small feet, problems where your hands and feet stay separated, or set up a traverse where your hands and feet stay separated the whole way. So there's no high stepping, there's no toeing down and rocking over and posting up, none of that stuff. That is a good way to train very specific stiffness through the posterior chain that really applies well to climbing. You climb indoors with these big footholds, but then you go outdoors with middle footholds. There's something lacking there for a lot of climbers. And again, it's one of those, I'm stretching for the right word, but something you're not aware of. It's kind of an unknown thing that's holding you back, that it's unintentional that you're climbing at the gym always on good feet. But when you get outside with bad feet on a steep boulder or a steep route, you're lacking in that posterior chain. And so the deadlifting would address the muscles, and then the wall climbing or the wall training that we talked about would bring it home and kind of apply it to the rock. And so those two coupled together is quite powerful. And that's something I do a lot of with my sons, is coupling a physical exercise with then a climbing specific application of that strength. That form of complex training, if done right and in proper dose, is quite powerful. And again, you're not going to find that in my book, and you're not going to find it on an internet cookie cutter program. It's something you would need to probably work with a coach in person to really help you cobble that together in a beneficial way.
Well, that's great. Thank you for all that. I really like the traversing on decent hands but small feet idea. That's a cool.
Yeah, isn't it a novel concept?
Yeah, it is.
So often, we're locked into like our fingers are the limiting constraint, and they can be. But there are so many other things that are limiting constraints. And here's the thing: if you have a weak core, your fingers are being overcharged. Every time you grab a hold on an overhanging route, you're being overcharged if you have a weak core. And by stiffening your core, and by the way, improving your flexibility as well, your ability to move your center of gravity into proper position, you are being overcharged on your finger force. And just like dead body weight, if you're carrying 10 extra pounds of fat around your waist, or if you're carrying extra muscle mass that you don't need because of, say, inappropriate training, that is also dead weight that is overcharging your fingers. And so, again, the goal is to optimize all of those areas. No single area is the answer or the magic bullet, but it's trying to optimize things in all of those areas. And so you can't just obsess on, I have to lose more weight to be stronger on the rock. Well, losing weight to a point can help, but losing weight to the point of being unhealthy will make you injured and miserable, and it's no way to live life, And so that's finding the happy medium, what is optimal for your genetics and your lifestyle, and then trying to dial in all of those, other influential areas equally well. That will get you to the promised land 10 or 20 years from now of maybe approaching your genetic potential. But for most climbers, they're not even close to that yet, because there's so many other things that they can potentially dial in. But the first thing you need to do is become aware of the weakness or the flawed way of thinking or the flawed way of training. And again, circling back to the idea that every year you should be trying to kind of reinvent your training and evaluate and design a more effective program. Now, if you're someone that walks into the gym every day reinventing your program, then that's a very flawed strategy as well. My friend Steve Bechtel's fond of pointing out, people who just are always changing up their training program, trying a new training program, and never sticking with something for 10 weeks. How do you know if something works? If you don't stick to it for a period of time. And so there needs to be this natural evolution. And you can't have this day-to-day trial and error, because you're never going to suss out what works and what doesn't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. To that point, do you have like a minimum that you like to shoot for committing to a program, like a minimum program length?
Well, for me, and really for my sons, we all do a daily undulating periodization where we hit each energy system once or twice per week. And so there's a lot of variety in our training, but there's a method to the madness. Because we are all in a position now, we're trying to climb for performance most of the year, because we have occasional trips and weekend ventures and such. So, but that's us. Everybody's different. If you're going to go on a more entry level or intermediate climber that's going to have a more periodized program, I think a 10-week training cycle can be quite beneficial. That has a very comprehensive strategy that is being rolled out. And then again, an elite climber who is really concerned about performance and keeping all the energy systems up to snuff is kind of doing the opposite of that, where it might from afar look like a shotgun approach because they're doing every week a wide variety of things, but there's actually a method to the madness, like how we, doing strength and power one workout and then doing power endurance a separate workout, because they're calling into play two different energy systems to two different degrees. And so they are best being separated into individual workouts. And so I try to, hesitate, on a podcast, or if I just run into somebody at the crag, I try not to give overly specific training advice, because that I'm more likely going to miss the target without knowing more about the individual and such.
Well, I want to pivot to the other major topic that I mentioned at the start of the conversation that I want to focus on with you. You've mentioned your sons a number of times, and you just talked about, training with them at home. I would love to hear, what are some of the key differences between their training and your training? Hey, friends. Just a quick note before you go. Eric is the founder of a company called PhysiVantage. He started the company with the mission to bring science-backed supplements to the climbing world. And he is offering listeners to this podcast 15% off your first order. So you can check out his line of products at physivantage.com and use the promo code NUGGET15 at checkout. You can find a link right there in your podcast app. And as always, you can find links to that and everything we talked about in the show notes at thenuggetclimbing.com. We talked about PhysiVantage and some of his products and the science behind them in part 2, among many other topics. So be sure to tune in next week for part 2. And in the meantime, much love to you all. And thank you so much for listening.
Shake it up, stop when the clock hits 13. Sing 1, 2, 3, 4. Cause no one can do it like we do it, like we do it, like we do it. Cause no one can do it like we do it, like we do it, like we do it. Cause no one can do it like we do it, like we do it, like we do it. Cause no one can do it like we do it, like we do it, like we do it.